Nosso próximo convidado, Martin Wolf, é um dos mais influentes colunistas do jornalismo econômico global e um destacado analista do fenômeno da globalização e seus desafios quanto à regulação dos mercados. Formado em Oxford, foi economista sênior do Banco Mundial e hoje é o principal comentarista do Financial Times, jornal que trabalha desde 1987. Para entrevistar Martin Wolf, gostaria de convidar ao palco o editor internacional do Valor Econômico, Humberto Sacomandi, para conduzir a conversa acerca das perspectivas econômicas internacionais e a retomada da economia no Brasil. Por favor.
Bom dia. Como o Fred disse, o Martin Wolf é um dos mais influentes jornalistas de economia do mundo, possivelmente o mais influente. Imagino que muitos de nós lemos semanalmente a coluna do Martin no Financial Times, que o Valor Econômico publica. Então, é um imenso prazer tê-lo aqui hoje. It's a huge pleasure to have you here today.
It's a great
Martin.
pleasure to be here.
Martin, as you surely know, Brazil is living a very strong, a very hard recession, and we'll face many challenges ahead, but it will be good to have a favorable world economy this year, next year. I think all of the major world economy are growing right now, moderately, but stably, and inflation is quite low everywhere. Is this the basic scenario for next year?
Certainly the consensus is the same will be true for Brazil, so that you are coming out of your recession. I hope this is true. So I think the world economy is growing. The expectations of the future have stopped getting worse. Things are stabilizing. We're actually growing everywhere. Every significant economy is now growing. And the general mood, I think, in the economy is quite optimistic. And the best estimate, I believe, is that that's going to continue. It is the most likely outcome. There are a lot of forces forcing this to happen. Monetary policy continues to be very supportive. We are now far away from the Great Recession, sufficiently far from the Great Recession and the subsequent Eurozone crisis that sort of confidence is returning. There's a big backlog of investment to be done in the Western world because there wasn't very much. The financial sector is clearly stronger. Growth itself is helping. It's sort of self-reinforcing. There's been a lot of restructuring of banks, including recently even in Italy. The commodity prices are basically stable. That we've gone through that correction. So I think the best estimate has to be that we have a reasonable upswing, though underlying trend growth, I think it's very important, in basically every region is lower than it was before the Great Recession. Because of the composition of world growth, that is to say, particularly Asia is much bigger, this doesn't reduce aggregate world growth quite as much as it does the individual components. But the underlying growth in the Western world, in most developing countries, including, of course, China, is much lower than it was before 2007. So it's not going to feel quite the same as it did before then.
But of course, you have risks around. Political, economic, geopolitical, economical risks. Could you talk a little bit about the economical risks?
Let me just say one thing which isn't so, well, it's a risk in a sense, but it's a thing we understand least. And it's most obvious in the Western world, which is underlying growth of supply potential. So let me give you one of my favorite statistics for the West. By 2020, on current trends, the GDP of the whole advanced world, which is still around half the world economy, depends on how you measure it, will be about 1/5 smaller than it would have been if pre-crisis trends had continued. 1/5 smaller.
That's a lot.
That's an enormous difference, and it explains, in my view, fundamentally why there's so much unhappiness. We're poorer, and we're sharing the poverty around, and a lot of it has fallen on people in the middle of the income distribution, and they really don't like it. So one of the biggest, and this is not explained, at least as we are now, by an enormous rise in unemployment. In most Western countries, not all, unemployment is back to where it was before the crisis. So it follows very, very simply that underlying trend growth of productivity has been massively slower than we'd expected. I've already mentioned this. So one of the biggest questions, which is a risk that actually goes both ways, but might even go on the upside, is will it continue like this or will it get better? And if it got better, that would change everything. Previous financial crises in world history have always lowered growth through a recession, but the subsequent growth has varied. Sometimes the trend is growth is slower than it ever was before, which is where we seem to be. Sometimes the trend is the same as it was before, but from a lower level, and sometimes even there's been a catch-up. The most famous example of catch-up actually is after the 1930s, when the United States, by 1960, got back to its pre-30s trend. So the first huge uncertainty is what's going to happen to supply. And it's an immensely important one for the developed countries and for the world. Then the second big questions relate to demand. We've obviously had chronically weak demand. We know more or less why. Investment's been very weak after the crisis. We have a huge debt overhang. People have not been willing to borrow, and banks haven't been willing to lend. The central banks have, as a result, pursued these extraordinarily aggressive monetary policies by historical standards in terms of both their balance sheets and interest rates. We rely on those policies continuing. We are not yet in a position, not probably even in the US, and certainly not elsewhere in Europe or in Japan, to go back to pre-crisis monetary policy. So demand remains chronically weak. So a big question is there a risk that something could happen that would force monetary policy to tighten rapidly? And the most obvious risk is inflation starts surging. We're seeing no sign of it, and it's very important that that remain the case, but that's the second big risk. The third big risk is the normalization process itself, which is now only started really in the US. And the question is, will that start causing serious disruptions to the flow of global capital, taper tantrums, as we saw before, and could it transmit itself to unexpectedly fast rises in long-term interest rates, which would certainly be seriously disruptive? In that context, I think, and it's very much linked to another pretty obvious risk, all asset prices, equity markets, bond prices, are extraordinarily high by historical standards. And they are therefore, I mean, really extraordinarily high. And if there became a shock to nominal and real interest rates, that could change. We could have a big asset price correction, and that would certainly affect the demand side. And then I've already mentioned the debt overhang. If interest rates started to rise and the economy started to slow, we might start getting back into debt problems that we've been growing out of. Those are all pretty sizable risks. I just stress one other economic risk, which is sort of partly political, partly economic, which was actually mentioned by the previous speaker, which is the hostility to globalization. By the way, I agree with everything he said on, and indeed was a theme of one of my books, that globalization had hardly begun. But what we see is financial globalization, cross-border financial assets, have shrunk very considerably relative to world GDP. That's not so true for foreign direct investment. It's very clear for financial assets. And trade relative to world GDP is stabilized. If we did go ahead with serious protectionism, then of course we could expect start to see a real decline in world trade relative to world GDP, and that could become a very dangerous vicious circle. And the politics around that are obviously fragile. I'm modestly optimistic from what we've seen so far from the Trump administration, that its bark is much worse than its bite, but who knows? So those seem to me to be the main global economic risks with one crucial exception, which I'll just mention, which is what's going to happen to China. I'm pretty optimistic that they can manage their difficulties, but it's obvious to anyone who looks at the Chinese economy that maintaining its growth continues to depend on an incredibly high rate of investment, the highest in world history, close to 45% of GDP. Much of that investment is excessive. It isn't justified by Chinese investment opportunities today. It's associated with an explosive and continuing growth of debt relative to GDP. And the only thing one can say about something like that, the sort of point the great late Rudy Dornbusch made, is it can't go on forever. Nobody knows when it will end. I don't think it's at all imminent, but that is another final, pretty important economic risk.
So we could face a debt crisis in China, just like Japan in the 90s?
I think it will be very different, though it has some similarities. In China's a creditor nation. The liability side of the balance sheet is entirely owned by Chinese people. The Chinese government, of course, owns all the banks. It has exchange controls, which Japan didn't have anymore. And more important, it still has real growth potential. Japan had already caught up. China, I mean, one way of thinking about that is when Japan hits its crisis, its GDP per head was at purchasing power parity measured in international dollars was 80% of US levels, and China's is now about 30%. So that means it still has tremendous growth potential. So I think after adjustment, it will be very simple for them to grow out of this, but the adjustment could be quite painful. It could go with a period, not of a depression, but of really low growth, which no one is expecting. It's not in the general expectation that China would have a period of really low growth. I don't think this is at all imminent, by the way, but that could easily happen. It wouldn't be 20 lost years, maybe 3 or 4. But that would be quite a big shock for the world economy. It's a huge source of demand for the world economy, very much for you, and it is clearly a risk out there we have to recognize.
And about the political risks, we have an unpredictable American president. We have a war in Korea. I don't know if you believe in a war in Korea. Political risks in Europe, Brexit. How this can affect the economy?
Well, first of all, I think most of these political risks, though not all, are the byproduct of a long period of income stagnation for very large parts of our populations, and then multiplied massively with the Great Recession. I've mentioned the lost incomes we've had. There are many different measures of this, but probably about 80% of the populations of the major developed countries have had stagnant real incomes in the last 10 years, something like that. It varies by country. This is not sort of unprecedented. They're very unhappy, and they have therefore voted for things which are, in my view, extremely foolish and hugely counterproductive. Well, I'm going to leave Mr. Obama to talk about his successor. But I suspect I will agree with what his views. If he expresses them, he might be too careful. And Brexit was a comparable decision. France dodged a bullet, but politics remains very fragile in Europe. Even Germany, though it's completely solid and safe, and now has a very large extreme right party in the Bundestag. So the politics are a product of the economics. But that's the first part. The second part, I think, of the geopolitics, which I think is very important to understand. So that's, and itself is also related to a lot of the phenomena that I mentioned economically, is that we are in the middle, early stages, if anything, of an absolutely historic transformation of world power. An extreme speed, what's more. So people have referred to the 19th century as the era of the Great Divergence, when the Western countries shot up in incomes per head, wealth, power, and the rest of the world stagnated, most notably China. And we're now, in the last 40 years, this is all going to reverse. And it's going to reverse at an amazing speed. So China has come from absolutely nowhere to be, 40 years ago, to be, on some measures, a larger economy than the US, and it's clearly on the way to becoming a larger economy than the US. This is a massive power shift which has profound geopolitical significance because it means the Western world no longer runs the world. The Westerners no longer run the world, which I've always felt is natural and inevitable and has to be accepted. But it doesn't mean they like it. So and many friends of mine of different persuasions are pretty convinced that a conflict between China and the US is ultimately unavoidable. Graham Allison from Harvard has recently written a book about this on the so-called Thucydides trap. If you look, and this is the end of this, if you look at where we are right now, there are a series of major friction points between the world's two greatest powers. They are about trade, of course, and misbehavior alleged of China, and they're also about North Korea, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. And we have a very bellicose American president, and we have a Chinese president who will not accept being seen to give in. I mean, I think, so this is very, very risky. There's obviously miscalculations can occur that lead to disaster, and one can't possibly say the risk of that is zero. It's clearly very significantly greater than zero.
As you said, we are going through a major power shift to Asia, mainly to China. How will be this century, the Chinese century?
I really don't know. Obviously, the way I think about this when I tried to think about I think sort of anything can happen in the next century, and most of the possibilities are awful. And I'm not trying to be facetious about this. We've got to the point, so let me make the big point that I've been trying to make unsuccessfully in many columns over the years. We've got to the point where humanity's activities shape the entire planet in a way that was never true before, environmentally most obviously. We've got to the point in which we have the capacity to destroy civilization with our weaponry. And those weapons are, again, after a really successful effort to deal with proliferation, proliferating again into the hands of people nobody would really want to have them. So and each year, it seems to me, not having a nuclear war is sort of dodging a bullet. I tend to the view that over a sufficiently long time period, a nuclear war is a certainty. It must happen. The question is how and how we respond to it. So that's an immense, so here are two immense risks, environmental destruction and thermonuclear war. And we can't ignore these, and people would stress many other horrors. If we leave those nightmares aside, but they're there, I tend to think that if we manage the next century, it won't be a Chinese century or an Asian century or anybody's century. It will be a collective century. That is to say, we are moving into a period where no one power will dominate the world, as the Americans were able to do in the second half of the 20th century, particularly the early part of the second half of the 20th century, well, and on after the fall of the Soviet Union. And if we are going to manage the world, it will have to be, however much people dislike it, a cooperative effort. And that will mean quite a high level of understanding between and even sympathy between countries whose cultures, politics, values differ radically. And that's the test. That's the test. China is going to be a gigantic power, quite possibly the world's biggest, but it won't be able to run the world on its own. The West will remain very significant throughout the 20th century. Other powers, India, will certainly become more important. I hope Brazil. And we will cooperate to manage this world, or in my view, we're going to destroy it.
The West is not reacting well to this power shift. So we have been a political fragmentation all over the West, in Europe. The Brexit problem is a byproduct of that, the election of Mr. Trump. Can it get worse?
I think it would be, I've written this, it seems to me fair to say that at the moment, as a geopolitical entity, the West does not exist. There's a sort of historical association between these countries because they had a common origin. You know, the United States, indeed here, the European influence is pretty obvious. But politically, the alliance at the moment is really more or less completely dysfunctional. Furthermore, as you pointed out, Europe is changing in this context. Britain is leaving. I think one of the most colossal strategic blunders ever committed by my country, and we have a long list of strategic blunders. So it's quite impressive. Germany is trying to work out what this new and very dangerous situation means for a country which is so powerful, but it still has to relate to all its neighbors. There's obviously a change in France, which might lead to a resurgence of European movement, and the economy is clearly helping. There's a very difficult relationship with Russia, which the Americans, Mr. Obama was very much part of that, I hope he'll be asked about it, really left to the Europeans to handle. The conclusion I have at the moment is that the Western alliance more or less doesn't exist at the level of values, and at the and that was pretty obvious in the last year and 9 months, and nobody really knows whether NATO, which has always been a very one-sided relationship of dependence, which I don't like. I think Europe should have done far more. But it's also not clear whether really and truly, whatever has been notionally said, the United States under Mr. Trump stands behind NATO. So I think there is no West. When there is a vacuum, others fill it. And you can see that with China and Russia. One of the most extraordinary events of the last year was when Mr. Xi Jinping went to Davos and told the world that China was the one last true believer in globalization. It's almost the only point that the previous speaker made, which I didn't agree with, when he said that there's this huge backlash against globalization. There surely is in the West, no question about it. Not much in Germany, actually, but in other Western countries. But there isn't a backlash against globalization in the rest of the world. Oh, well, it's certainly not in China or India. They believe in it. So that's another one of those puzzles, and it means leadership is shifting away from the West. Ultimately, I think this is inevitable. The West contains about 12% of the world's population. Its share in world output is declining. Its historic position was a result of a series of accidents brilliantly exploited, and it's over. And we are finding it very, very hard to get used to this idea.
You mentioned Brexit. Is Brexit irreversible?
Nothing is irreversible. I mean, the future can always be changed. But I think it's unbelievably unlikely to be reversed now. And there are several pretty obvious reasons. First, it's really difficult to go back on a referendum if you're not going to hold another one, and we don't want to. That's one of the many reasons why, in my view, referenda are insane and should never be part of democratic politics. I mean, this used to be the position of the British people. I mean, we never had referenda. We regarded them throughout, until 1975, when we had our first, as a tool of despotism. And that's exactly what it was under Louis Napoleon, under Hitler. That's how they were used. So it's very difficult to reverse a referendum. Second, our two main parties are fundamentally and profoundly split on this subject, and neither can generate a consistent policy of reversing Brexit without falling apart. Basically, if either the Conservative Party or the Labour Party were to say, we are absolutely convinced it's a mistake and we're going to stop it, those two parties, in my view, would fracture. They would disappear. And the first aim of all political parties that survive a long time, and both have survived a long time, particularly the Conservatives, but also Labour now, is to keep together. And that means they fudge everything. Which, of course, if you're the government, is impossible, but it is why the negotiations are a disaster, and we will almost certainly not reach a deal, in my view. That's what's going to happen. So the only party in Parliament that really wants to stop this is the Liberals, and they have 8 seats. Or maybe it's 10, I can't remember exactly. Anyway, not enough to make any difference. So the political context is impossible. The only circumstance, I think, in which you might imagine this happening is if Britain hit an immense economic crisis. And unfortunately, it is now becoming reasonably obvious, instead of causing an immense crisis, the Brexit process is slowly reducing our growth rate, reducing the value of sterling, just sort of making things more miserable. And this becomes rather like the famous story, which I've always suspected is apocryphal, that if you put a frog in cold water and boil it slowly, it just dies quietly without ever jumping up because it doesn't notice the change in temperature. I've no idea whether it's true, but it's a famous story. So and I wouldn't dream of experimenting on frogs to find out. So unfortunately, by the time we realize it's really made us poorer, both poorer and significantly more irrelevant or less relevant in all possible respects, it'll be far too late. I think we have to assume we'll leave. The only interesting question is how we leave, whether we get a deal before 2019, we have a transition and a final arrangement which is reasonably tolerable. On those points, given the fact that we don't have a government, we don't have a governing party, and the opposition is as split and incompetent as our government, I'm very pessimistic. I would like to say, I know you have a few political problems in Brazil, and our problems are a little bit different from yours, so I won't go into that in details, but in terms of high-level incompetence, I believe we match you completely.
Well, I think most of people here will doubt for you, but...
Would what?
We'll not agree with you.
You would not agree, okay.
Anyway.
That's up to you to decide.
Well, you mentioned Brazil. Let's go back to Brazil. We face strong political challenge. We have elections next year. But a crisis is also an opportunity, as you always say. What should we do?
Well, to solve the political crisis, this is obvious. I've been thinking about your political crisis. I know, obviously, I read about it, but I'm not going to make any comments on the political crisis. It has occurred to me that it has the one event in my lifetime which seems to have many similarities in the West is the Tangentopoli crisis, which basically destroyed the Italian ruling elite. And the Italians, unfortunately and tragically, decided to deal with this crisis by electing Silvio Berlusconi. This was a very serious mistake.
20 years of Silvio Berlusconi.
And 20 years of populist irresponsibility, which inflicted terrible damage. So the crucial thing, in my view, if you have a crisis of this kind and the whole establishment is discredited, is to get somebody new who isn't that sort of populist. And there's always a very big risk of that when people are so disillusioned with all politicians. And America has done the same with Trump. On the economics, I followed Brazil moderately closely without any real expertise. It's not a country I ever worked on, but I was in the World Bank back in the 70s, during actually the very tail end of the very famous Brazilian boom from the mid-60s to the 70s. My view has always been that Brazil is a country, obviously, with stupendous natural resources and entrepreneurship. Therefore, it will never be a disaster. It's always going to do okay. Its trend may be wrong, given the rate of national savings, the rate at which education improves, human capital improves. Trend growth in Brazil, from an economic point of view, is around 3.5, 4. When it's higher than that, it means it's going to go down. When it's lower than that, it's going to go up. It's just a matter of time. You're very vulnerable to the commodity cycle, and global finance has always been a real menace for you. And it's partly a real menace for you because you're so reliant on foreign savings, and that's inherent. I believe that the rate of growth in Brazil could be improved on trend. The trend could be raised, but it would involve doing things that it seems incredibly hard to do. And one of them, this is so obvious that it, and I mentioned this before, is to raise the rate of national savings well above 25%. You can't grow much faster without that. And that would require, clearly, a fundamental transformation in the political process, the fiscal process, and the savings system. And that's just one small part. So these are structural issues. Otherwise, you will grow, you will succeed, you will probably be reasonably stable, but it seems to me that's where you are.
Will not be China.
Nobody will ever be China. India will never be China. Indeed, it's perfectly obvious. I'm not surprised, in a way, by what's happened in China. No one who has any knowledge of Chinese history, we've got 4 seconds, so I'm going to any knowledge of Chinese history or the Chinese people can be surprised by what China is doing. And it isn't over. It isn't over. China is unique.
Martin, thank you very much. We could stay here for so long, but that was wonderful. Thank you.